Israel's rocky transition from British protectorate to independence created a hostile relationship with its neighbors and turbulent circumstances for Palestinians. In this lecture, we'll look at the circumstances surrounding the birth of the nation of Israel, and after it, you'll understand the formation of the State of Israel and the origin and nature of its land feud with Palestine. In the run-up directly prior to the War of Independence, there were around 700,000 Palestinians that fled or expelled, many of which are still living in refugee camps to this day. And also there were about 856,000 Jews who were displaced from surrounding Arab countries. The civil war that was taking place between Palestinians and Jews within the Palestinian Mandate soon led to an interstate conflict when its neighbors attacked Israel. In the run-up to this, just a few brief bullet points that after 30 years of attempting to create a stable homeland for Muslims and Jews in Palestine, the British gave up on the task and washed their hands clean of the entire affair. In May of 1948, they packed up and left Palestine to solve its own problems. Almost immediately after they left, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish provincial government, formally declared Israel's independence. What happened next was that Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq immediately declared war against the newborn state and invaded it the very next day. The question is, why did they invade Israel? It's not simply a matter of Muslim versus Jew. After all, Muslims and Jews had coexisted in the Ottoman Empire for centuries, but it was a number of reasons. One was that it was understood that Jews within the British Palestinian Mandate were overstepping the bounds, the territory that the UN had originally set up, and allocated a certain proportion to Palestinians and a certain proportion to Jews. Well, what was happening was that Israel had taken significant, not only all the land that was originally allocated to them, but 60% of the land allocated to an Arab state. It is known amongst these Arab states that there is a battle between Arabs and the Israelis are grabbing more than their fair allotment of land. But another major issue, you have to remember that these surrounding nations around Israel are also very new nations. Jordan, Syria, they're formed after the British and French protectorates and these lands that were split up in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So what they see going on are opportunities to extend their borders. For example, in the run-up to the war, Israel had secret negotiations with King Abdullah of Jordan in order for him not to attack Israel. They said that he could annex the West Bank if he didn't do so. Well, he didn't honor the side of the agreement. But that was one goal of King Abdullah, to annex the West Bank. Furthermore, King Farouk of Egypt also wanted to annex the Gaza Strip and the southern and major parts of southern Palestine. Nuri al-Said, who was the strongman of Iraq, wanted to bring all of the Fertile Crescent under his leadership. So there's a lot of jockeying going on where these different Arab states see opportunities within this war to bring more land under their new nations. Also, they want to be seen as the protectors of the Arab world, so it's a publicity thing in one sense. So this isn't just a matter of Muslim versus Jew, but there's a lot of political considerations going on with why these nations immediately attack Israel after it announces its independence. Plus, they also thought that it would be a fairly simple victory since a one-day-old nation wouldn't be able to defend itself very effectively. Well, this ended up not being the case. To fight back, the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli Air Force were formed out of Israeli militias established during the 1936-1939 Arab revolts. The Palestinians really had no fighting force to speak of, but amongst Israeli militias, they were fairly well equipped and trained, and due to the economic development that had been taking place in the run-up to in the early 20th century, and the British supporting them in the fight against Palestinians within the Palestinian Mandate, they were fairly well equipped in this battle. Overall, this military apparatus proved successful, and it won the first of many battles in the 20th century against superior Arab numbers. In this fight of independence, major fighting ended in March 1949, and Israel signed armistice agreements with Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. Israel and Iraq are still technically at war to this day. So what happened afterwards? Following the end of the war, Jewish Holocaust survivors and inhabitants of nearby Middle Eastern countries flooded into the new nation, which increased the population from 800,000 to 2 million between 1948 and 1958. This also definitively tilts the demographic balance in favor of the Jewish inhabitants. But what happens to the Palestinians? While this signaled a victory for the fledgling Jewish state, the plight of Palestinians, unfortunate enough to be living within Israel's new national borders, was just beginning. Between 1948 and 1949, many Palestinians fled the new Jewish state with hopes they would be able to return home after Israel's defeat. However, this obviously didn't happen, and with the new nation of Israel, few were readmitted after the war and most lost their homes. Furthermore, almost 800,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their homes within Israel during the war. So this is something that, although it happened 2 or 3 generations ago, there's still a hope amongst some Palestinians that they can return to their homes, and many have detailed knowledge of their homes and have passed down this knowledge to their children. And it remains a very important symbol of this unwrongful, from their perspective, being taken from their homes and being denied what is rightfully theirs. Of course, significant autonomous pockets of Palestinians remained in regions within Israel. The first was the West Bank, an area bordering the Mediterranean Sea that had been controlled by Jordan since February 1949. Jordan also controlled the eastern portion of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. The second area was the Gaza Strip, which was controlled by Egypt. None of these 3 countries accepted Palestinians into their country as refugees, as these nations had their own internal problems and couldn't absorb a few 100,000 individuals. The Palestinians were left in a legal limbo status, and today the descendants of those original Palestinians number 4 million refugees. They still haven't found a nation who will claim them as their own, nor have they been able to create a nation of their own despite numerous peace accords. Of course, armed conflicts don't stop between Israel and its neighbors, the most famous of which is what we'll look at in the next lecture, is the Six-Day War of 1967.